Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna go ahead and hit record.
Okay.
So, you ready?
Ready?
Okay, cool. So for those who are watching this, this is Dr. Jacob Robinson. He's one of my professors, and we are going to be discussing a book called The Value of Nothing. And when I first saw this, I thought it was a Q, so I thought we were going to look at like some QAnon stuff. But this is it's how to reshape market society and redefine democracy. So I guess to start us off, you had suggested this book. I was just curious how'd you hear about it and what interested you about it?
Yeah, one of my former students contacted me and we were talking, and he is currently working on an organic farm and then also trying to sort of use that to bring healthy food to his community and also use it as opportunity for a revenue source for the underprivileged people in his community. And for him, this is sort of an exercise of his faith. And he sort of is just struggling when he started trying to get into the system of like food production, and he realized how corrupt it was and how it is almost impossible to sort of get healthy food to people at a reasonable price. And so he read this book, and it really just sort of opened his eyes about how this really is a systemic problem of the market economy. So even something as simple as feeding the hungry becomes a massive like hurdle to overcome because of the system. And for him, as part of his faith, he took that part of the Bible seriously, talking about feeding the hungry. And so he was trying to do that, and he found it was really difficult. So he's like, yeah, you should read this book. As an ethicist, you would enjoy like the analysis of the system and just trying to figure out how can we do this better. And I took it as a suggestion, and it's a fascinating book, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Interesting. Yeah, I actually have a friend too who just recently left a job and went up to like a farm in Maine, and they're kind of living a totally different life right now. And so I'd like to follow up with him at some point, and maybe it sounds like maybe they're doing some similar stuff. So I don't know. But anyway, so yeah, so what this is going to work is we're going to we both came up with like about 5 different things that really resonated with us, and we're going to kind of read some quotes from the book and then interact with it a little bit and ask each other some questions. And it'll deal with kind of a mixture of economics and theology. And those are kind of the lenses that we're kind of seeing this through. So I don't know, did you want to start off with the first one on page 4?
Yeah, I'll go and start with that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it is important just to acknowledge that it was interesting that both Rick and I, when we were reading through this book, we both realized we were reading a book on economics and government and democracy, and we saw so many different parallels with religion and theology, and just even the way they function. So I thought it was interesting. We sort of had these same questions of like, wow, this could actually apply to the church as well. And so I think it's really fascinating to look at this perspective and even use the market economy and capitalism and democracy as a lens by which we can actually understand religion and Christianity better. So I think it's a fascinating way to sort of use another field to actually understand religion and theology even better. So yeah. So I'll start with the first little quote and let you see what you think about it. So this is Raj Patel is the author. And so he writes, "One thing is clear. The thinking that got us into this mess is unlikely to rescue us. It might come to some consolation to know that even some of the most respected minds have been forced to puzzle over their faulty assumptions." So when I've read this, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, this sounds like religion, this problem. So that's one question I want to ask you, Rick. Do you think this quote actually applies to religion and theology as well? The idea that the thinking that got us into this mess is unlikely to rescue us? What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And this is like right there at the beginning of the book. It jumped out at me too. He's talking about Alan Greenspan coming to terms with the 2008 housing crisis, and how How he admitted he was shocked at some of the flaws in the system that he didn't realize were there. And I think that that's something that we all, even in the religious world, we're experiencing a lot of lately. A lot of us are rethinking our politics. We're rethinking even our theology. It's, you've heard the word deconstruction. A lot of us don't like that word, but it's the word that keeps popping up that we use. It's, we're questioning the embedded assumptions about the way things are, the way things work, how things operate. And like in the political world, like the conservative answer in conservative politics is really like, well, you keep cutting taxes, you keep cutting regulations, and eventually the system's going to, work out the kinks. And then in the conservative theological world, it's like they'll say they're okay with questions as long as you stay within the same systematic theological conclusions. And so we're going to still have retributive justice. We're still going to have this real like heavy penal justice system, and we're still going to believe things exactly the way we have, but somehow we're going to come to different results. And I think what we need to come to terms with is we need to be willing to question some of those assumptions that we have about the way things are.
So a follow-up question. So what is it about the nature of religion and theology, sort of like capitalism, that actually prevents it from like the people who do it, from not only puzzling over their own faulty assumptions, but ever admitting that they got it wrong? Like, what is the nature of religion and theology that even prevents that from even happening?
I think a lot of it depends on the nature of the religion. Like, if you have a religion that's based off of a fear of punishment, then you're not going to want to question your assumptions. If you have a religion that's based off of love and curiosity, and an admitting that like we're looking into the infinite here, and we're not going to have this all figured out, then I think there's going to be a childlike curiosity that you could have with those questions. So I think it really depends on the nature of your religion.
Yeah. And I can't help but think when I see this quote, the sort of the cliche sort of definition of insanity, of trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Do you think that applies here as well? I mean, especially with the church. I mean, is it just minor changes that they're willing to do, but they really need to do major, like, or are we just sort of stuck in this sort of insanity loop of trying the same thing over and over again? Like, how would you think, is the church actually being insane by not trying anything new, or is there hope that we're going to change something?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's like there's a famous pastor who once said he's a fundamentalist with jeans on. And at first I thought like, oh, that's like an amazing quote. He's like, because I was thinking you could still be cool and hold to this theology and not question these things. And then now I'm like, wait a minute, he's a fundamentalist with jeans on. It's like you can change your pants, but you can't, that's not going to solve the problem. And I'm not suggesting that we just start switching things up and just throwing everything to the wind and trying new things with no guidance at all. But what I am saying is we need to be willing to do more than just change our theological pants.
Great analogy.
You want me to ask you the one
Yeah.
from page 7?
Let's go to this
So
one.
on page 7, he said it would be, and he's still kind of talking about that shock that comes from questioning your assumptions. He says it would be too big a shock to have the fundamentals of policy in both government and the economy proved wrong, and to have nothing with which to replace them. So I was wondering if you could just speak to this feeling of shock that we have when what we thought was fundamental begins to be proved wrong, and yet we're in this weird place where we're not quite sure what to replace it with.
Yeah, I think that gets to the nature of like part of our human nature in our resistance to change. There's just like this idea that our resistance to change is often based upon the fear of not knowing what's coming next. And usually that is subsided if you actually know what's coming next. But if you don't know what's coming next, people they'd rather stick with what they have, even if it's very substandard, than moving into a space that they don't know. because it could be worse, right? With this, it seems like people tend to be more glass half empty when it comes to changing things for the future. And so even though they experience this shock when their system isn't working, whether it's a religious sort of ideology, all of a sudden well, let's be honest, a global pandemic hits, and you're like, how can your belief in God accommodate this idea that millions of people just died from this disease? Or it's the death of a loved one, or in one of my friends' cases, the death of 6 loved ones due to this disease. And there's a shock when all of a sudden this fundamental idea of a loving God has now disappeared. And the problem is the government has failed this way too, right? There are many people who just they're unhappy and they're miserable, and they're going paycheck to paycheck, and it's not what they thought democracy was about. They didn't think that's what the American dream was a scraping just to survive. And I think this all comes down to the idea that until we actually have a solid idea of replacement, that shock value will actually prevent us from trying anything new. I really do think that the fear associated with the shock will prevent us from trying anything new until somebody actually has a legitimate sort of like, hey, we can replace this with this and see where we can go with this. But until that happens, whether that's in the economy or whether that's with government or with religion, until you have that future option, most people don't have enough of an adventurous spirit to just go for it.
Yeah. And I think even like, especially in the theological realm too, we get that a lot in these, when people start to see some of the issues with like inerrancy or something, and they're like, well, then if the Bible isn't inerrant, then does the whole thing fall apart? And do I have like no foundation upon which to stand? And do I just go out and murder people? Like, it's like, what do you replace this with? It's not just the fear of punishment. It's the fear of, this is like just my fundamental way of seeing reality. And like, I can't change that. Like, where do you go from there?
Yeah. And this is where like the idea of worldview becomes really important. And you don't realize what your worldview is until there's a crisis moment or it's challenged. People's worldview of democracy is usually pretty peachy until they have an experience when democracy fails them. They have this sort of Pollyanna view of capitalism, and until they're in an experience where capitalism doesn't work and they just don't have enough money. Theology and religion works great, well, until it doesn't, until all of a sudden, what you thought was going to work didn't work. And so that crisis, that moment actually puts you into this spin, and people, and they don't know what to do about it. So,
Yeah.
Okay, ready to go
Move on to the next one? Yeah.
question number 2. Okay, this is coming from on page 22 out of Patel's book. So I'm going to read a little bit and then let you respond to this. So there's a little background here. It says, he's talking about market economies. He's like, I am not, however, arguing for a world without markets. The idea of a market as a place in which people with diverse needs exchange goods is one that can be found in every human civilization. What characterizes today's market is exchange not driven by needs, but by profit. It is pure ideology to think that the best way for society to function is to let the market seek profit, and that the best way for markets to function is with minimal interference. The terms on which markets operate are set by the powerful. Our tragedy is to have let this happen. I think the very last sentence in there is the one I think that's the most fascinating. And it's the idea of markets aren't bad. Human culture has been doing for a long time. But what happens when you let the powerful and the wealthy set the terms of the market? And why does everybody else let it happen? What do you think? How does that play out both in society and in the church?
Yeah. And I'll add another quote to that he mentioned. He said, the blindness here is our faith in a faculty that so routinely betrays us in the demonstrably false promise that profit-driven markets can point to true value. And I think there's that idea of betrayal here. Like, the powerful may not notice how we're being betrayed because they're benefiting from it. It's really hard for me when I pour my cup of coffee in the morning to know how somebody in Africa may be being betrayed by all of that went into, took place to get me that cup of coffee. And so the and again, you see that we're just simply not aware of that. You see that in even in throughout church history. Like, after the apostles died, the church bishops began consolidating their authority, and then you had these church councils that determined orthodoxy, and these were made up of very powerful people. And then even later, like with Origen, he's like one of the main guys leading this, and all of a sudden later he's deemed a heretic by somebody else who's in power hundreds of years later. It's like and so I just think, like, we need to recognize that, and maybe somebody who's in power came up with a great idea theologically. Maybe they're coming up with some great ideas economically. I'm not speaking to that right now, but I think we just need to at least recognize the fact that the powerful are the ones who make these rules. And then we need to be cautious about really fully buying into that, especially when the threat of the sword is used against those who would question it.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges. I mean, this quote, I agree to his observation, but that very last section where it says, "Our tragedy is to have let this happen." Is that actually a perspective of privilege? Like, in some ways, is the idea that, like, we could have done something to stop this? And that becomes a fascinating question. I mean, people ask that regarding the transatlantic slave trade. Well, why didn't the enslaved Africans just revolt and stop? And so it becomes that question of, are you blaming the victim here with this quote? Or are you being honest? The whole point is that the powerful have the power, and so they can set the system however they want, and they control the people who can then subdue and oppress those who can't. And so, so what do you think about that? Is it actually the tragedy that we let it happen? What about in the church? Is it a tragedy that we let this happen? Or is this just something that we have to live with?
I mean, it's the reality that we find ourselves in. So I think we need to be aware of that. And then we need to begin out of that listening to people on the other underside. We need to start educating ourselves. And we can't just pretend like it didn't happen. It did happen. So now where do we find ourselves? Well, we find ourselves with a great opportunity these days where people are writing about these things, and people are educating us about these things. And so we need to have the humility to put ourselves in a posture of learning and listening. And that's something that I think, especially like a lot of the liberation theologies are offering us today, are different voices from people on the underside, from all kinds of different contexts of how they're seeing from their perspective. And we need to not, again, the powerful create the rules here. The powerful Christians will often tell them, well, your perspective is illegitimate. You can be a Black person and talk about your theology as long as you agree with all of these 5 points that we set up. It's like, no, you need to, like, not give them the rules. You need to listen to what they have to say and put yourself in a posture of humility, learning from them.
Yeah, with this question of our tragedies to let it happen, I can't help but think, especially in the history of the church, like, the first thing that came to my mind was Constantine. And like with the Council of Nicea, I mean, it was the first time that a non-Christian person became essentially dictated how this council determined their answers. And I can't think, man, how did they let that happen? And I'm like, why didn't somebody do something? And then I realized, well, because Constantine would have killed that person.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things you're like, man, was there a way around this? Yeah, without trying to murder Constantine. I mean, it really begs the question, like, what could they have done something different? I'm not sure they could have. So.
Yeah, there are moments in church history, like, Abelard versus Anselm. What if we had followed Abelard instead of Anselm? How would the rest of church history look differently?
Oh, that's
a whole nother question.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast right there.
Yeah. We could go on to the your second one, I believe.
Yeah.
So he says on page 17, the history of slavery shows not only that the set of things allowed into markets can change, but also that decrees establishing what belongs in markets can be revoked. Once slavery was allowed, now it isn't. In other words, there is nothing natural about buying and selling things for profit and allowing markets to determine their value. Before commodities can be bought and sold, they have to become objects that people think can be bought or sold. So what is unnatural about the system and having to make things commodifiable?
Yeah, it's one of those things that this is where you see how ingrained market economy is in everything. That in market economy, almost everything is commodifiable, even to the point of people's organs, right? That they've drawn a couple lines, but not very many. But essentially, almost everything has been commodifiable, and I think it was all because people had bought into that system that it was. At some point, I mean, throughout much of human history, there were things that were simply not commodifiable. Actually, land was one of them. That no, land wasn't to be parceled out and owned. It was to be used and to lived off of by everybody. And they even had these systems to sort of make sure that people didn't take too much, and so everybody could be fine. And especially human bodies was one that wasn't. And then all of a sudden they thought, oh, we can profit off commodifying these Africans, and we can make lots of money off them by not having to pay labor costs. And so for me, the idea that I'm like, no, this isn't natural. This is a human creation that and unfortunately the greedy and the powerful have created. It's the greedy and the powerful who want more, right? They're not content with what you have. It's you want more, and so you create a system that gives you more. Unfortunately, the consequence is that there's a lot of tragedy in the midst of that. So I think first of all, the importance is recognizing this is not natural. This is actually human created. But I also think that is our way out. The man I wrote my doctoral dissertation on, Howard Thurman, he actually talked about, he's like, these human systems, whether they be race, class, ethnicity, language, he's like, these are systems created by humans, and they can be decreated by humans. Like we have he's like, these systems are not absolute. And it's when we actually believe them to be absolute that we actually sort of restrict our ability to change them. It's like when we finally realize that we created them in the first place. So if humans created them, we can change them. Now, granted, I think he also recognized that there's a lot of power and money that keeps those systems in process. But I think for those who are suffering under these systems, the first step is just recognizing, first of all, these things shouldn't be commodified. And two, we created this system of commodification, so we can uncreate the system of commodification.
Yeah, it's like that awareness. Having that awareness can then give you the power to do something about it. It's interesting. Yeah. Often I think about even like something like time being commodified. Like when your time is commodified, it's like you can't even be really present because now there's a monetary value going on there.
Yeah. Well, even relationships, time with your spouse, with your friends, all of a sudden becomes commodified because you could be spending that time making money, right?
Mhm.
So then all of a sudden your friendships become commodified. And I'm like, what if then we just become tools of the market, and we actually degrade our own humanity in the process, and others as well, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay. Ready for a fun little story? This is a little interesting research that was done by Gary Becker, and I'll read the whole story, and then I'll see what you think about this, Rick. So here goes. But beyond systematic human irrationality, Gary Becker's assumption about preferences being the same across all societies just doesn't hold water. In many North American indigenous cultures, generosity is a central behavior in a broader social and economic system. One anecdotal account examined what happened when boys from white and Lakota communities received a pair of lollipops each. Both sets of boys put the first one straight in their mouths. The white boys put the second one in their pockets, while the Native American boys presented it to the nearest boy who didn't have one. It's not surprising to see that culture can shape how resources are accumulated and distributed, and dictate the social priority of saving over sharing. But the experiment also reminds us that the opposite of consumption isn't thrift, it's generosity. First of all, when you read that, first of all, did it surprise you? Or did you like, yeah, that sort of resonates with what? And then for me, I think this story is fascinating in regards to the church. I mean, that's what I like to hear you talk about is how do you think this would play out in the church? If you gave sort of little white Christian boys lollipops, what do you think they would do with them?
Yeah.
So first of all, what was when you
Yeah.
read this, what do you think?
Well, it wasn't shocking because I'm a stay-at-home dad for 5 kids, so especially when lollipops are involved, selfishness can rule the day, you know. So
Right.
um so it wasn't shocking, but I think it's kind of funny, like if you look at the story, like you never quite know how you're going to react in a situation until you're actually in it. And I think it's speaking to that gut instinct that we have when we're living in scarcity.
Hmm.
And like, what do you do in that moment? I've got 2 suckers, I'm going to keep one for later, and I'm going to enjoy one now. Or am I, or am I going to offer it to somebody else? The the ones who offered it to their friends, like they had a level of awareness that the ones who didn't simply didn't have. And I think really like what this comes down to for me is like, how wide is your circle of embrace?
Hmm.
Like, at what point does exclusion begin? And ultimately, this is why I don't believe in theologies of exclusion, because it's like, where do you draw the line? Everybody is loved by someone, and so at what point are you going to not be generous to somebody? You need to be generous to everybody, because if you're not generous to one person, then you are you're rupturing that oneness that we have. And I think take it the white boys thing to the white men context. I think that might be one reason why, especially in churches, what do white male pastors do? If they have an elder board, they're all basically white men. So I think we see this appearing all throughout Christian institutions. We tend to share power with those who look like us and are just like us, or I guess we hoard the power for our own, group.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating metaphor, right? What if lollipops was power, right? What do
Mm-hmm.
you do if you knew the lollipops were power? What do you do? Do you hold the power for yourself, or do you share it? So then here's the follow-up question to that. What do you think sort of Christian ideology actually teaches? Because I would agree with you that Especially within the church, generosity is not, it's not great unless you're on the inside. Then if you make the relationship of like to power, then I really don't think like they're real generous. But what does Christian religious ideology actually teach us?
Yeah, and this is where going back to who you mentioned earlier, Howard Thurman, it's what something that's been helpful for me has been distinguishing between Christianity and the religion of Jesus, because Christianity as this institution has had a history of power and of power accumulation and of colonization. And whereas the religion of Jesus that he actually talked about was, he served on the underside of power. He met with people where two or three are gathered. He served the thirsty. He clothed the naked. And he said that when we do these things, when we're generous in these ways, we're doing it for him. And so I think I don't want to dismiss and cover up the exclusion that has come within the institution of Christianity, but I also want to recognize the difference between that and what Jesus called us to do for the least of these, and as for him.
Yeah, I think of the passage that says, look not to your own interest, but look to the interests of others. And I think, man, how different would the church look like if we actually like employed that on all levels?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, we sort of apply it like on your personal relationship level at some point, but what happened if our church leadership actually applied that principle when they didn't look out for their own interest, but the interests of others? Yeah, it
Yeah.
might look a lot different. So yeah, might look a little bit more like the religion of Jesus than our modern version of Christianity. So,
Yeah, and maybe the religion of Abelard. I don't know.
yeah.
um so moving on to your third one, on page 21, he says, seeing the world through markets not only distorts our sense of ourselves, but projects our own disability onto everyone else. So what is this lens of markets that affects how we, or what is it about this lens of markets that affects how we see ourselves and what we project onto our neighbors?
Yeah, when I read this one, man, instantly the connections between market economy and the church became evident. And even just how market economy has infiltrated the church, and especially a lot of modern evangelical churches. Because the lens of a market makes everybody a commodity, right? They are either labored to be used or consumers to be used to purchase. In either way, or in some ways, with the church, it's consumers to take their money, whether it's
Mm,
through their time or through offering or whatever. And so, but in this market lens, everyone is a commodity of some sort. And what's interesting is with essentially the way that a lot of modern evangelicalisms come, with these like the seeker-friendly sort of model, is that everybody who comes in the door is a potential like consumer. Um,
mm-hmm,
and literally like a potential consumer of Jesus for your own profit. And they aren't wanderers looking for solace. They aren't curious searching for a God. They are essentially, there's somebody coming looking for a sale. And so what does it mean when we have taken the deep yearnings of our heart and our spirit and we've commodified it? And what's interesting is I think when we have taken this market view, not only of religion itself, we actually see ourselves from it. Like, oh, I have benefited from this, right? I have this and this and this, and this other person needs it too. So I'm going to become the great marketer of Christianity for this person. And the thing is when you do that, you're actually projecting your own distorted marketed view of faith upon them. You don't even allow them to sort of like engage God on their own terms. you essentially start forcing them to engage God on your terms, which are sort of distorted in the first place. So to me, this is tragic. Man, I wish we could just pull out all the sort of marketing principles that churches have been using for the last 30 years and sort of see what would the church look like if we actually based each other on relationships, not as market values.
Yeah, I remember it's been, I guess, what, almost 20 years now since I've read this, so forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but the one of the biggest books was The Purpose-Driven Church. And I distinctly remember he had this page called Saddleback Sam, and it was a picture of this guy named Saddleback Sam, and it was like, this is this guy's makeup of who he is. This is how much money he makes. This is what radio stations he listens to. This is what movies he likes to watch. Now let's like craft this religious experience to like attract him like almost as a customer type thing. And that has really permeated a lot of the way building churches has happened. Even in like you get the seed money of the prosperity gospel stuff, you plant your seed of whatever of $100 or something, and all of a sudden God's gonna reward you with all kinds of money down the road. It's almost like an investment thing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember there's a church here that I went to for a while, and I sort of stopped going simply because I was greeted so many times before I even got to the sanctuary. One morning I counted, I got greeted 7 times by the time I even got to the sanctuary. Oh, we're so glad you're here. Thanks for coming. Thank you. I'm like, I've been going to this church for 3 years. Like, I know why I'm here. I know where I'm going. I don't need to be greeted like I'm a stranger. In fact, the fact that you think I'm a stranger means there's maybe a problem here. And it just got really, I'm like, really? Am I just this person that you want to try to make happy so I come back again? Is that really what the church is about? And then I remember I had a conversation recently with a friend who went and visited an Antiochian Orthodox church. It's sort of a version of Greek Orthodox. And he told me the story when the first Sunday he went, he walked in and the priest said, just so you know, we don't care that you're here. He's like, because it's not about you. This is all about God. So don't expect us to cater to you. We don't care that you're here or not. But hopefully you're here for God. And when I heard that story, I'm like, man, that would be so refreshing if we actually didn't think it was about us and meeting our market expectations of consumerism. What if it really was just about God? But yeah, and I wonder, but my guess is most marketing principles probably wouldn't say that would go over very well. So.
Yeah. I think it's like this connection here in this quote, from distorting our sense of selves and projecting onto everyone else. There is a connection here between self and neighbor. The way you treat yourself is the way that you tend to treat others. And I think ultimately that's a reflection of how you see God. And so like there is a self neighbor God convergence going on here, and usually the way you see one is the way you're going to see the other. But yeah, and when you're using that through the lens of profit and marketing, it's probably not the way a healthy relationship is supposed to function.
Yeah, and I think competition is another great thing to talk about with this. I remember watching one of I think it was The Bachelor or something like that, one scene. I watched it once. I'm like, the idea that like competition being the foundation of a love relationship is really jacked up. Like, is that really how love is supposed to start, with competition? And then I sort of asked, man, but churches will do the same thing. Churches feel like, they're competing with each other for your attendance and your money. I'm like, is competition really sort of the way a faith relationship should be based on? And you're right. And I wonder, is that based also on this idea that we think God is competing for our love or something like that? I don't know. But yeah, this idea of competition, and it's like, is this really the best foundation of love and faith? My guess is probably no. But
Yeah, and I wonder if the competition may be ratcheting up as the people who are going to churches is dwindling,
yeah.
and if maybe there's a relationship there.
Yeah, a little supply demand relationship. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see what's next. I think I got another one for you here. This will be coming off page 34. And actually, I'm going to read a little bit more, just get you more background. So I'll start on page 33. This was actually a guy doing some people doing some research regarding like generosity and selfishness among chimpanzees and other primates, and then also correlated to humans. He writes, humans have an advantage over chimpanzees because we have not only the possibility of punishment, but the quality of mercy too. A particular striking set of experiments demonstrates this by asking you to put some money for me in an account. The sum grows, and you can then choose how much I should give back to you, threatening me with the option of a fine if I do not cooperate. When you don't threaten me with a fine, I tend to give more money than I would if there were the possibility of the fine. So having the ability to punish, but choosing not to, increases cooperation and trust. I know for you, there's something you've been thinking a lot about regarding your faith and even how you understand everything. So how did this sort of story relate to you regarding the idea of like punishment and being fined as opposed to just letting people be generous?
Yeah. So like I grew up in the 1980s and 90s, which you might remember was like the convergence of purity culture and left behind culture, and then Bill Clinton came into office, which was like, everyone thought was the end of the world. um like I literally, like, I grew up in Georgia and we had a Civil War reenactment thing going on the other side of the street from my school, so we were literally hearing about all this stuff with bombs going off in the background, which was interesting. But we were just terrified, like at any moment the rapture was going to happen. Bill Clinton was going to hand the United States over the United Nations, and we're going to become a one world government. And then so there's just a lot of this religious and political fear that we had. And I think that, like, just the entire system was just built on this fear of punishment. God's going to punish the world with the tribulation. God's going to punish you if you don't get all the stuff right. God's going to punish America. Um and again, I go back to the 1 John 4, where he says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. And then ironically, he goes on to talk about loving your brother. And so that's the implication of this. And so I think that for me, like, seeing this is just coming to terms with, okay, if there is a God, like, yeah, he could punish me for whatever he wants to do. But I came to this point in my relationship with God where I realized, if that's going to happen, then I'm just screwed anyway, so I mean, like, there's nothing I can do about that. And so, like, what if God actually wants to have a relationship with me? What if God does want this relationship to be based on love, because that's where healthy relationship goes. And that's where I think a lot of the fear for me just disappeared. And so I think it's in that coming together in love of self, neighbor, and God that we do move forward. It's in that convergence that liberation does happen. And so that's kind of where I've been at with that.
to bring Peter Abelard back up, it's interesting because I do think that a lot of this, especially within Christianity, stems back to this whole idea of atonement theories and the idea of like this fear of punishment for God, that somehow my sin dishonored God and I'm going to be under God's wrath. And so whether it's penal substitution or satisfaction theories, like all these sort of are based on this fear and this idea of punishment. And then all of a sudden we have this Peter Abelard who says, no, it's actually not about punishment. It's actually about love. So what do you think about, so what's the benefits of maybe understanding of atonement theory through the concept of love as opposed to punishment?
Yeah, and I think I mean, for one, I just look at healthy relationships. Like my relationship with my wife is based off of love, and we never think about punishing each other. Like if we thought about punishing each other, what would that do to our marriage? Like it makes no sense. And I think it's ironic, like there's a new book that just came out, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and one of the people she mentions is Peter Abelard, and she mentions how he stood up for women and fought for women to be able to utilize their gifts in preaching. And I just think, just an observation, it's interesting that the guy who has an atonement theory based on love just happens to be the guy who is standing up for his sisters. And again, I think he was probably a complicated guy. I don't want to idolize him and act like he didn't have any issues. I'm sure he did. I know he did from some of the things that I've read. But when you start with that, ultimately atonement theories and justice is about what makes things right. And when what makes things right is about punishment and getting even and settling a score, it doesn't foster a healthy relationship. We all know that intuitively. We need to begin to realize that theologically and accept that theologically.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, next one.
Yeah, let me see here. We're at
page 30.
Page 30, yeah. Okay. So on page 30, he says, in other words, a good predictor of cooperating well in these sorts of games is having been involved in exchange and money in other contexts. This is an important clue. Exchange itself might not be the source of the problem in explaining our current economic crisis. The problem lies in the system that surrounds the act of exchange. So I often hear conservatives, and especially conservative Christians, denying the existence of systemic evil. And so I'm just curious, what are you seeing here regarding the source of our problem being at a systemic level?
Yeah, so I thought this was really fascinating because the study was is sort of asking what happens when people who don't know each other, and especially come from different demographics, are expected to cooperate. And what it showed was that people who didn't know each other didn't cooperate. And people who didn't know each other cooperated more. And I guess that pretty much makes sense, especially when you start throwing in various demographics, whether it's race, ethnicity, language, gender, those sort of things. And so, so there's this aspect that the system actually perpetuates this, not because the exchange isn't possible, but because the system itself creates the separation which prevents the cooperation. If you're for race studies, I mean, this is why segregation back in the early 20th century, and then now in what we call separation, it's now voluntary, it's not legal like it was, but it's still practiced. And the whole idea is when you have a system that's based on segregation and separation, people don't cooperate across lines. It just creates all these different sort of tribalistic views. And the people who could actually benefit from sharing of resources, sharing of ideas, working together for a greater cause, can't and don't, because the system itself is one that institutes separation. And so when I read this, I was like, man, yeah, the problem is that the system forces separation, but that also means the solution is really simple. We need to initiate new relationships. And when you actually initiate new relationships across these lines, whether it be race, class, gender, ethnicity, language, religion, when you actually initiate these relationships, cooperation becomes much easier. But we are so stuck by this system of separation that we don't even see the potential of collaboration. And so it is one of those things where the system, it works, but it's permeable. It can be changed by just people saying, no, I don't have to remain separated. I can actually take the initiative and start relationships and cooperating with people who are different than myself. And man, I wonder how different the church would look if we actually took that seriously. If we didn't buy into this sort of like market competitive sort of mindset that groups are competing with each other, and opposed, like, no, we're actually should be cooperating instead of competing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like I did my undergrad at Bob Jones University, and like we were taught that God is holy, and holy means to be set apart. And so we are fundamentally separated from God. And so then it's like they would then look at human relationships in terms of separation. And so historically, like Bob Jones didn't allow interracial dating until 2000, when, again, getting into the political world, George W. Bush went and campaigned there. The media, notices, why are you speaking to the school that won't allow Black and white people to date? And then, all of a sudden the school changed their mind on this. And they had this like theology going all the way back to Babel on this and everything. And so it's like the Tower of Babel. And so it's like, but now like they want us to act like, okay, we've settled our racial issues, but they've got all of these other things, like especially like women are separated into these roles. And it's like, and so they still use the same, like the created order is something that they talk about, of how everybody needs to be separated. And it's like, well, you're using the same exact argumentation of separation that you used during segregation. So how are we supposed to now trust that you have wisdom here in this situation and you're not actually doing the same exact thing?
Yeah, and it's interesting is that's not even just religious, it's also just this ideology that has sort of permeated a lot of sort of white Eurocentric culture that was very evident in colonialism and various other things. And so to sort of transition to the next quote, since we were talking about women, I thought this one was really fascinating. This is on page 67. And it says this. The cheaper it is for workers to survive and reproduce, the better for profits. While it is beyond the means of any single capitalist to lower the price of labor power, it is something that they together can fight for collectively. Wait, am I doing the right one? Yeah, okay. Sorry.
That's right.
Yeah, so they can fight collectively, as we shall see. To reproduce workers requires more than making babies. It's a long process of child rearing, feeding, clothing, housing, educating, socializing, and disciplining. And the costs of this are the source of perhaps the most fundamental misvaluation worldwide: the market's treatment of women's work in the home. The daily work of rearing children, maintaining a household, and engaging in civic work, the unpaid slabs of work that feminists have called women's triple burden, remains unpriced worldwide. So this isn't just something that has gone noticed regarding the exclusion of women. It is also part of what has been their social, political, and economic degradation as well. essentially claiming women's labor isn't worth anything. It is of no value, yet it becomes the essential sustainer of society, that without the rearing of children, their society doesn't perpetuate. So I find it really ironic and tragic that our market economy and culture has essentially degraded women, saying their work is not of value. I know this is obviously relevant for you, considering your current position. So how did we read this?
It broke up a little bit there, but I think I can answer that from what I heard. Yeah, so you back?
I'm back.
Okay, cool.
Do I need to repeat?
So I'm assuming you're asking about how do I feel with like reading that from my perspective?
Yes.
Yeah, so because I'm a stay-at-home dad and have been in that role for the last year, I guess since January 2020. So yeah, it's interesting. Like I never thought about getting to the quote, thinking about babies in terms of like reproducing workers. Like in a capitalistic system, that's what you're doing. You're creating future workers for this market system. And so it's just interesting, like we have these stay-at-home parents who are raising and training the workers of the future, and yet they don't get paid for this at all. And overwhelmingly, this is where our society has placed women. And so as a stay-at-home dad, I'm starting to see the challenges that a lot of women face. And it's a role that this is the role that they're put in, the role they have to play. I think, again, getting back to complementarianism, it tells you this is a role you have to play. And it's kind of funny, like for me, because like all the books or articles that I read about being a stay-at-home parent or about homeschooling, because we homeschool our kids, they're all like written to women. And especially the Christian resources, they're all about being a complementarian biblical woman. So I'm like, for me to learn practical advice from people who know about what I do, I'm learning about how to be a biblical woman, which I'm not even a complementarian. So it's just kind of funny. But I think it really gets like to this whole, like, what is your lens of value? Like when you think of it in terms of like, you know, an individual job, I hear people all the time say, well, stay-at-home moms, like they don't deserve any money. They're not working for it. They don't have a boss. They made this decision. They're not producing anything. But like, if you just back up and have your lens be at this like social level, the national level, you can begin to see like these women are like fueling our future. Like, how does that not have value? And I think that's one of the things that this book brings out a lot is this concept of value. You miss out on what is where the true value lies, and you don't see the effects of the damage and the extent of the damage that it causes when all you're thinking about is, in this moment, my bottom line, my profit margins. You just miss out on a lot of that.
Yeah, and I think you hit a really important point there, in that we've been trained to think so myopically, that our field of vision is so narrow and so shallow. Like we have not been trained to see the big picture. We've been trained in a world of immediate gratification, and also this idea that we have to keep progressing in purchasing. It's like, yeah, the whole keeping up with the Joneses thing. It's like we're less of a human if we don't keep buying stuff. And I'm like, where did we learn that? But yet it so permeates our understanding. And so when there is stuff that isn't actually purchased, like, well, raising kids, you need to purchase a lot of things to raise kids. Yeah, it's, they don't even know how to evaluate it. And I'm like, man, we've lost the whole idea that like parenting and friendships like no longer have value, and it's tragic.
Yeah, and we don't even have, and I think part of that is we don't value the togetherness that our nation has. Like, we are producing an economy together, and when we don't have that togetherness mindset, we think I've got my job and I shouldn't have to pay for somebody else to raise their kids. But when we have this togetherness mindset, well, maybe we need to ask some questions about what value they're playing in our future, and maybe we need to uh, work to support that in some ways that we wouldn't in that individualist mindset. So speaking of our desires and everything, going on to page 87 and 88, he's talking about this concept that Hobbes presented of humans being inherently machines of infinite want. But then he counters that with Rousseau by saying, it was possible, Rousseau argued, for people to feel that they've got enough. Being sated is something that people can learn, and it is after they have managed to control their instincts and impulses in the best interests of themselves and a society that they are truly free. So I just wonder if you could speak into this concept of freedom coming when we can manage to control our instincts and impulses in the best interest of ourselves and our society.
Yeah, this one for some people in a market economy, this actually may sound contradictory or even counterintuitive. Because when the whole idea is when getting more is the ultimate goal, like, yeah, that's just what you do. But it's interesting is that it's only when you break free from that impulse to need more that you actually are free sort of not to. When you actually can sort of get out of that, the whole system, the whole worldview of purchasing and more is better, and like all of a sudden there's a freedom that comes from that. I remember in my early 20s, I read a book called The Freedom of Simplicity, and it absolutely transformed the way I understood how I wanted to be in the world. And Richard Foster, the author, he wrote, essentially said that we only have so much energy to give. And whether you like it or not, your stuff requires energy. And when you are investing your energy in stuff, you aren't actually investing it in people. And so the freedom of simplicity comes when you can come to that point and say, I have enough. I don't need more, because the more I get, the less energy I have to give to my loved ones, the less energy I have to give to the people I care about. And so I think there is this true, actually going back to sort of like the greatest, or the second commandment of loving your neighbor as yourself. I think this is directly related to that you can actually love yourself by not loving stuff. And by not loving stuff, it actually enables you to love your neighbor. It doesn't say love your stuff as you love yourself. It says love your neighbor as you love yourself. But I think our market economy has spun that so much where we really do believe that we're supposed to love our stuff. And I'm like, really? Is that what this earthly life is about? So yeah, but it does take this mental shift of breaking out of that and really just sort of feeling, nope, I got enough. I don't need more. I don't need a new TV that's 4 inches bigger and maybe a little clearer. I'm not less of a person because my TV isn't as big as my neighbor's. That means nothing. But yeah, so I think it's interesting to when you break out of the market economy, it can actually transform relationships.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, like I find myself, like, I often criticize the fundamentalist past that I had, but I also find myself seeing like conversations that were had there where there was like these seeds of wisdom. Like when I graduated, one of the big things was like alcohol, like, oh, suddenly I can drink beer now, and so like there was like, I'm free to drink beer, Romans 14, and all this kind of stuff. You can't judge me. And I remember one time my mom said to me, she said, well, I feel like I'm free not to.
Mm.
And it just seemed dumb to me, like, well, come on, like it's so good, and but like I think in a sense there's some truth there. Like
Mhm.
freedom isn't the ability to just go out and do whatever the heck you want. Like freedom is the ability to enjoy a beer and the ability to not enjoy a beer. I think the market system is functions very much like an alcoholic in many ways, in an addiction, unhealthy addiction. But
I also think it's helpful to recognize that reacting to something isn't freedom from it. Like when you react to something, it still has a sense of control over you because you reacted to it. Like there's still this bond that it controls you in some capacity when you react to it. It's when you disarm its effect on you is actually where the freedom comes. So in some ways, yeah, your mom was absolutely right. That the freedom, like when you're reacting against this rule, you're still empowering the rule by reacting to it. And it's only when you're like, well, I can choose either option and that's fine, that you actually disarm the structure and the system. And so so I do think and that's where it's tricky, right? And especially when it comes to systems. And that's why some people push for revolutions. They're like, no, the system can't be fixed. And other people are like, no, let's try to fix it, make it better. They're more reform. And then other people are just totally assimilationists. But yeah, and I don't have clean answers on which is the best way to approach these systems, whether they're economic or governmental or religious. Some days I'm more revolutionary, some days I'm more reform. I try not to be assimilationist, but I also am completely honest that I'm complicit in the system because I participate in it. And so it's really interesting when you start looking at these, the idea of what is my freedom, within these, and how can I actually truly exercise freedom.
yeah, and how much of our systems, like going to those first things we talked about that we assume are just basic reality, like whether it's political or whether it's theological, how many of those were developed as reactions to something that came before? They weren't just there from all time. Like, they developed as reactions to something else. And I think it's important to become aware of that. And I think that's why, maybe studying church history can be kind of boring to people, or studying political economic history could be boring. But becoming aware of that, you can start to see the context of how these reacted to what came before, how they were handed down by power. And then you can dismantle that power then in that awareness. So I think we had
Awesome.
one final question.
Yeah, so I thought this one was interesting. There was actually a thought analysis that was done. They asked the question, if the corporation, so like the corporation being, well, any big corporation, were a person, what sort of person would it be? And I thought this would be fascinating to ask the same question regarding the church. If the church, what were a person, what kind of person would it be? Would it be a narcissist? Would it be loving and kind? Would it be generous? Would it be greedy? Would it be self-serving? So in your observation, if you had to just like take a big picture sort of like view of the church and say, what kind of person would the church be? How would you describe it?
So I actually, when I wrote an answer down, but I was thinking of a corporation. I was not
Oh.
at all thinking about a church. But reading this in the context of a corporation and thinking about it as a church is kind of funny. I said it would be like a sinister 5-year-old kid with full access to my bank account, no true understanding of value, and no regard for risk or future consequences. I was referring to a corporation, but I think a lot of that could be applied to a church. I can maybe come up with a better answer if I thought from scratch for a church, but it's kind of funny to think of the parallels there.
Yeah. And it's one of those things. I mean, I sort of changed the question on you a little bit, so apologize for the out of the blue sort of question. But I don't think it's wrong when you actually sort of see how the church has functioned. I do think that there are aspects. I mean, for me, I'd almost say the church is schizophrenic, or at least with multiple personality disorders, because there are times the church is loving and kind and generous and selfless. And then there's other times where it is completely sort of self-centered and a power monger and greedy and deceptive. And yeah. And so I think in some ways, I don't think you can have a single picture of the church because it is so diverse all over the place. But then also makes me wonder, is that a problem? Is that one of the reasons why, yeah, less and less people are becoming Christians this day? Because look at it, what is it? They don't even know what it is. Is it this corporate marketing sort of like principled sort of thing, or is it actually people trying to be selfless and kind? But yeah, so I think it is interesting to ask if we were to take a big picture, and then it also be interesting. I think this would be a fascinating question to ask if you ask people in the church what they thought, how they would answer this, like what kind of person would the church be, and if you ask somebody outside the church how they would answer this question, and then I think that'd be fascinating.
And something too, like as I've gotten to know other people who've been deconstructing, like I grew up with this very us versus them mentality, where people in different denominations, they were the them. You know, there was actually a cassette tape I had from Bob Jones called Us Versus Them. And the preacher was like, we are us and they are them. And but like when in this deconstruction conversation, as I've met others who have rethought this stuff, like I'm starting to realize like they, in their context that we thought they were the them, they had a lot of the same issues that we were dealing with. There was a lot more similarities despite our political geography lines drawn. You know, it's like we were Georgia and we thought Alabama was terrible, but when you think about it, it's like it's just ground and we're covering the same issues, you know. But anyway, well, this was actually just part one of the book. So there's a whole second part, and we're planning on meeting next week to talk through how the second part resonated with us. And I think one takeaway I come away with this just right now is just this wasn't a book about theology, but it was very applicable to theology. But also, how many times in this conversation did the relationship between self, neighbor, and God come up? And it wasn't just us making those connections, it was like actually in his writing. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, and I think I know from reading a lot of liberation theologians and liberation ethicists, they make these connections because they're like, no, the economy and the government, it really does affect religion in so many ways that a lot of times sort of white privileged people try to make that separation of church and state. But when you are under the thumb of oppression, it all weaves together. And yeah, and so for me, I'm like, no, this is absolutely connected to religion. Because yeah, how these market economies devalue people. Well, the people who usually get devalued at this are usually minorities and women. And so I think that absolutely is connected to self and neighbor and to God. And so
yeah. And we haven't finished the book, so I have no idea where he's going with part two, but I'll look forward to seeing where he goes from here and discussing it next week.
Sounds good.
I'm going to go ahead and I'll just stop it and edit it there.
Okay.
Oops. I didn't mean to stop my video. I meant to stop the recording.